The morning light over the Caucasus came slowly sliding across the low clouds like a blade drawn from its sheath. Down below the battlefield was still waking columns of smoke rising from burning armor, the distant rumble of artillery rolling across the earth. In that unsettled silence, a lone fighter cut through the haze, its Allison engine humming with a steady, unmistakable rhythm. The aircraft did not look like a champion. It was an American-built P-39 Airacobra, a machine dismissed in the West as the worst World War II fighter the United States ever produced. British test pilots had rejected it. American squadrons in the Pacific had suffered with it. By every familiar measure, it was a failure. And yet here over the Eastern Front, it moved with purpose. Inside the cockpit sat a Soviet pilot who understood something others had missed. At the altitudes where this war was truly fought beneath the high clouds, where bombers never lingered, the machine came alive. Its radio was clear. Its firepower was brutal. Its handling at the right height felt almost eager. So the question emerges, echoing across history. How did a rejected American World War II fighter become one of the deadliest tools of the Eastern Front air war? Long before the P-39 Airacobra earned its reputation on the Eastern Front, it began as a promise, a sleek prototype built for a very different kind of war. In 1938, engineers envisioned a high-altitude interceptor capable of rising quickly to defend American coasts. The first tests were remarkable. With a turbocharger feeding its Allison engine, the prototype climbed to 20,000 feet in minutes and reached speeds that placed it among the most modern designs of its generation. On paper, it was a contender for the future of American air defense. Then a single engineering decision changed everything. During wind tunnel trials in 1939, Army Air Corps officials demanded the removal of the turbocharger to reduce drag and simplify maintenance. The choice seemed minor at the time. It ruined the aircraft. Without that essential system, the World War II fighter suffocated above 15,000 feet. At 20,000 feet, where most Western air combat occurred, the engine lost power, the climb rate collapsed, and the Airacobra became little more than a target. A machine designed for the heavens was suddenly trapped close to the ground. The British discovered the truth first. Testing the export version, the P-400 RAF pilots found that it could not compete with Spitfires or Hurricanes at meaningful combat altitudes. Worse, the engine mounted behind the pilot pushed the center of gravity too far aft. When the heavy 37mm nose cannon ran out of ammunition, the aircraft became tail-heavy and prone to flat spins. Several British pilots barely escaped their test flights alive. Their verdict was blunt. The P-39 Airacobra was unsafe and unsuited for the war Britain was fighting. American pilots learned similar lessons in the Pacific. Over Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, the Airacobra displayed every weakness it had inherited from that fateful design change. Pilots described the aircraft as mushy at altitude, a World War II fighter that felt as though it were trying to move through wet clay. The Zero could circle around it almost at will. Even its most imposing weapon, the 37mm cannon, failed to deliver. By the end of 1942, the results were painful. Pilots begged for transfers to P-38, P-47, or P-51 squadrons. And when the only American ace flying the P-39 Airacobra was killed in a ground accident, the aircraft's reputation hardened into something close to bitterness. In the West, the Airacobra had failed every mission it was asked to perform. This is where its story should have ended. The journey that saved the P-39 Airacobra from obscurity began thousands of miles from the front. After British and American squadrons abandoned the aircraft crates of unwanted fighters, were loaded onto ships and sent north toward the Arctic or west toward Alaska. What happened next was a logistical feat as dangerous as any combat mission. From the Bell aircraft plant in New York, pilots ferried the Airacobras to Montana, then onward to Fairbanks or Nome. There, in the frozen silence of Alaska, American crews handed the aircraft to Soviet pilots, men who would fly these single-seat machines across the Bering Sea and into Siberia. Storms could rise without warning. Ice fog could swallow landmarks entirely. A single engine failure meant a fatal plunge into water cold enough to kill within minutes. Many never made it. Those who did brought the aircraft to staging bases stretched across Siberia, inching west with each flight until the machines reached regiments near the front. By the time a World War II fighter arrived in combat service, it had already survived a journey worthy of its own chapter in history. Soviet test pilots approached the Airacobra cautiously. With the nose ammunition bay empty, the aircraft snapped viciously into a spin that startled even experienced flyers. But once the testing moved below 15,000 feet, something changed. The Allison engine breathed freely in dense air. Controls tightened, the roll rate sharpened. Visibility from the cockpit was superb, a luxury among Soviet machines. And then came the revelation that would alter the Eastern Front air war: the radio. Pilots could coordinate turns, warn of enemy approaches, and execute complex maneuvers in real time. In a war defined by sudden ambushes and swirling dogfights over chaotic battlefields, this alone changed everything. Soviet mechanics soon added their own improvements. These modifications were simple, often undocumented, but transformative. In the hands of pilots and ground crews who adapted the machine to their environment, the P-39 Airacobra became something entirely new: a World War II fighter optimized for the altitude band where the Eastern Front was truly fought. And at those altitudes it excelled. In early 1943, over the Kuban region, the first results appeared. German bombers and fighters often operated between 8,000 and 15,000 feet, precisely where the Airacobra was strongest. Its firepower hit hard, its radio kept formations coherent, and its sturdy construction endured the punishment of low-altitude combat. It was here in these skies that the machine found the pilots who would redefine it, the men who would become the legendary Soviet fighter aces of the Eastern Front air war. By the spring of 1943, the P-39 Airacobra had become a familiar silhouette over the Kuban bridgehead. What had once been dismissed as America's worst World War II fighter was now flown by regiments that operated with a precision the Luftwaffe had not encountered before on the Eastern Front. Yet success never came without sacrifice, and the months that followed revealed both the power of the Airacobra and the price paid to wield it. The victories began with momentum. On April 9th, Alexander Pokryshkin scored his first kill in the aircraft. 3 days later, he shot down 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s in a single engagement, an unheard of feat for a Soviet pilot at that stage of the war. Then, on April 29th, came the battle that would enter legend. 8 Airacobras, guided by ground controllers and linked through crystal clear radios, attacked a formation of Ju-87 dive bombers escorted by Bf-109s. 2 fighters broke up or to pin the escorts. 6 dove into the bombers. In minutes, 12 German aircraft fell blazing to the earth. Not one Airacobra was lost. It was the kind of coordinated strike the Soviets had rarely achieved before, and it marked a turning point in the Eastern Front air war. But while the successes multiplied, losses did too. German squadrons received newer Bf-109 variants in the formidable FW-190. These machines struck hard, and the Luftwaffe's veterans were still lethal opponents. Soviet regiments flying the P-39 Airacobra often paid a steep price for the ground they covered. One of the most sobering examples occurred on May 31st, 1944. Grigory Rechkalov, already one of the rising Soviet fighter aces, broke formation to chase a retreating enemy fighter. When Rechkalov surged ahead alone, the unit's structure collapsed. 5 P-39s were lost in minutes. It was a brutal reminder that even a powerful World War II fighter could not compensate for the absence of cohesion. Behind the numbers were stories of endurance and survival. Others bailed out over friendly troops who greeted their descent with cheers. The ground crews who kept the Airacobra flying endured their own hardships, repairing combat damage in the mud, coaxing temperamental engines to life in freezing winds, and working through nights pierced by distant artillery flashes. Yet the machine persisted, and so did the men. When German radio operators intercepted the call sign, Sotka Pokryshkin's aircraft number, they sometimes advised their pilots to stay on the ground. Victory and loss intertwined, each shaping the legacy of the P-39 Airacobra. And yet the aircraft kept climbing into the gray skies of the Eastern Front Air War, flown by pilots who had come to trust it with their lives. To understand why the P-39 Airacobra failed in the West, yet flourished on the Eastern Front, we must look beyond the machine itself. The aircraft did not change between continents. What changed were the expectations placed upon it in the cultures that shaped the men who flew it. In the United States, air combat doctrine during World War II emphasized aggressive initiative. Pilots were encouraged to seize fleeting opportunities, chase targets, and press an attack even when the situation teetered at the edge of danger. This philosophy worked well for American machines that could survive such risks, aircraft like the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and later the P-51 Mustang. These fighters had altitude, performance, range, and energy to recover from mistakes. But the Airacobra, stripped of its turbocharger, was never designed for high-altitude pursuit. Asking this World War II fighter to escort bombers at 25,000 feet meant asking it to fight a battle it could not win. The Soviet approach evolved in the opposite direction. After catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, the Red Air Force re-examined its methods. Pilots began training in structured pairs and flights, prioritizing formation, integrity, communication, and coordinated attacks. Initiative remained important, but only within the framework of an organized plan. When the P-39 Airacobra arrived, its unparalleled radio clarity allowed this doctrine to flourish. For the first time, Soviet pilots could maneuver as a single, coherent organism, something that reshaped the tempo of the Eastern Front Air War. Maintenance cultures also diverged sharply. American ground crews followed strict technical orders. Unauthorized modifications were discouraged or forbidden. Soviet mechanics, by contrast, enjoyed greater freedom to adapt aircraft to their conditions. Removing wing guns, adjusting control cables, winterizing systems, each change was small, but together they transformed the Airacobra into a uniquely effective tool for Soviet missions. They did not try to make the fighter something it was not. They optimized it for what it could be. After the war, Western analysts struggled to reconcile these realities. But German records and post-war interviews with Soviet fighter aces told a different story. The Airacobra worked because the Soviets asked it to do the job it was built for. The aircraft did not fail America, nor did it magically excel for Russia. Its fate was shaped entirely by doctrine, culture, and purpose. When the guns finally fell silent over Europe, the P-39 Airacobra stood in an unlikely place. It had begun as a discarded design, a World War II fighter that Western pilots mocked and mechanics quietly dreaded. Yet on the other side of the continent, along the vast front where millions struggled for survival, the same aircraft had carved out a legacy built not on theory, but on the realities of the Eastern Front Air War. It had become a weapon trusted by men who relied on it not for altitude or glamour, but for clear radios, concentrated firepower, and a frame that absorbed punishment without complaint. For the Soviet fighter aces who flew it, Pokryshkin, Rechkolov, Gulayev, Glinka Klubov, and so many others, the Airacobra was never America's worst fighter. It was a machine that met them at the altitude where their war was truly fought. It allowed them to coordinate attacks that had once been impossible. It gave them a chance to challenge Luftwaffe formations that had dominated the skies in the early years. And in return, they carried it into battle again and again, trusting that it would bring them home. Its story reminds us of something larger than aviation. The value of a tool, whether a machine, a tactic, or an idea, depends on the environment in which it is used. The P-39 Airacobra failed when forced into high-altitude escort missions it was never built to perform. Yet it flourished when placed in the low and medium altitudes for which its design quietly excelled. Nothing about the aircraft changed. What changed was the world around it. There is a lesson here for every generation. We often judge people, technologies, or strategies by their failures in the wrong context. The Airacobra's journey from rejection to mastery is a reminder that potential is not absolute. It is conditional, revealed only when matched to the right purpose. So perhaps the real legacy of this World War II fighter is not just its kill counts or the final victory it scored on May 9, 1945. Its legacy lies in the idea that even the most underestimated tool can reshape history when placed in the hands of those who understand it. The battle is long over, but the history is still being written.